Hey folks, in this interview, we're going to be talking about and demystifying the art of nude photography and boudoir. This is TWIP. Hey folks, welcome back to another episode. I'm here with Cam Atree. He's an Australian-based photographer who is kind of talented. He is very talented and knows his way around shooting nude women and boudoir and all that whole genre, as well as the business side, everything. So we're going to take this interview from the standpoint of, hey, tell me how I do this if I want to get into it, and tell me, if I want to shoot, what are the different tips and techniques you can throw at me, and some of the pitfalls that I might want to avoid. Cam, welcome to the show, man. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me along on the show. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, it's the pleasure is all mine. I'm impressed and humbled by your work. It is fantastic.
That's too kind. Too kind.
No, it's not. No, I'll link to it in the description for the YouTube video and in the blog post for this episode, so people can see for themselves what you're doing over there. No, very good stuff, man. I want to with these kind of interviews, when you and I have literally just met a few moments ago.
Yep.
So I want to start it with kind of an introduction. So tell me who is Cam Atree, right? How did you come to be the photographer that you are today? What was that trajectory?
I guess it was kind of ingrown into me as I was growing up. My father was a keen amateur photographer, but mostly he was interested in landscape and wildlife and nature, and that's how I started. And I studied photography after I left school because that was the only thing I was really interested in. And for quite a while, I was pursuing the wildlife route. I did a trip to Antarctica and Africa and places like that. And but after a while, I realized it was really difficult to kind of make money out of wildlife photography unless you were, had the backing behind you to be able to travel, 9 months of the year kind of thing. So I didn't have that. So eventually, I started shooting people. Generally, I'm a pretty shy guy by nature, so it took me a little while to get used to sort of photographing people. It actually started by accident. One of the local models who was just getting started contacted me randomly and asked me to do a portfolio shoot with her, and I literally had about 3 people photos on my website at the time. And this would have been back in the early 2000s, around 2003, 2004. And I fell in love with it pretty much straight away. I loved the interaction working with her, and eventually started shooting some of her friends. And then eventually, I should, get rid of all these other apps.
Oh, no, you're fine. Your stream is perfectly fine on the site. Okay,
good. So yeah, started shooting some of her friends, and then eventually around about 2004, I think 2005, I did my very first art nude shoot. One of the girls asked me to shoot some nudes of her, and then I started working with some traveling professional art nude models from around Australia, and I was hooked then. So I've been shooting art nudes now since around 2005.
I love that. Yeah. Can you, with that, you're obviously an expert at what you do, and you live and breathe this every day. Like we talked about before we started interviewing, there's a stigma that's associated with photographing nudes, right? So, yep. And I wanted to dive in and sort of hopefully demystify, or at least shed some light on it. And I'll put a fine point on it. So there's boudoir in no particular order or hierarchy, but there's people look at glamour photography, they look at boudoir photography, they look at fine art nudes, and then far away from this stuff is the porn stuff, which is just for that purpose, right? So
for sure,
demystify that world for people that see it all as one thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just aren't exposed to the whole breadth of it. They get exposed to pornography mainly because it's so freely available on the internet. And for a lot of people, that is the only reason to look at a naked woman or man in some situations. So a lot of people with that, which don't have kind of an art or photography background, aren't really exposed to the artistic side of it. And that's something that I would love to see become a little bit more mainstream, and that sort of realization that the human body is nothing to be ashamed of, and we all have one, and we all should all appreciate everybody's body equally. But it's a difficult thing, especially when you're dealing with different people's upbringings, whether it be a religious aspect or just some sort of morality in their lives as they're growing up. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it obviously stems from their parents and what sort of things they instill in them as they're growing up. But my parents, I wouldn't say they were extremely liberal. Mm-hmm. And my mother and my father, he passed away about 11 years ago now, but he was, extremely proud of what I'd become as a photographer. And my mother is proud as well, but, she limits her exposure to my work to a degree, She appreciates that I love it and it's my passion and also my career, but, she looks at some of the images, but, she keeps it down to a degree. So yeah, I can understand, not everybody is totally comfortable with it, but I think if they understood the differences, it would make a great difference in how everyone accepts it.
Well, put a finer point on that. The differences. So the differences between, say, let's take two. So glamour and boudoir, right? Yep. So the differences between those two genres.
From my point of view, boudoir is a little bit of a softer approach. It's a little bit more sensual without being sort of in your face. Glamour is probably more designed to titillate. If you think about, Playboy, Penthouse, that sort of style of photography, that's what I depict as glamour. But yeah, I think boudoir has a bit more of an innocence around it to a degree. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you are dealing a lot more with intimates, as in the clothing that they're wearing, underwear and nightgowns and things like that.
More suggestive, right?
It is more suggestive, definitely. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And then moving into the nude. So when you do fine art, and I always want to preface that with fine art nudes, right? Yep. Or nude. Or you tell me, what's the best way to say it? Is it fine art nude? Is it artistic nude, or just plain old nude photography?
I know a lot of people have issues with calling it fine art. So I prefer to call it artistic myself. Okay. In the past, I have referred to it as fine art, but probably over the years, I've realised there's probably a little bit of a difference in what I shoot compared to, what you may see hanging in a contemporary art gallery, which would be classed as artistic. I think there's a lot more, less technique and more, I guess, feeling and emotion and things like that in a fine art image compared to just an artistic nude. Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah.
So with like fine art nudes versus artistic, I tend to think of it like, and I'm just one person's opinion, right? So I think when I think fine art, my brain goes to Rembrandt and Van Gogh, right? And that's where or weird art pieces hanging in the Museum of Modern Art or something. Right?
Exactly. Yep.
And then when I think of
for me.
Yeah, nude photography, I think more artistic, right? It is art. You're telling a story, or there's a million words you could use, but I think artistic, like you pegged it, is perfect for that. So
yeah.
So with the challenge, what are some of the challenges with that? Because you're running a successful business around this genre. Some of the marketing vehicles that we have to use today in modern businesses are YouTube and social media and Google AdWords, etc. What are some of the challenges around marketing this type of photography using those services?
It's extremely challenging because you're facing roadblocks in just about all of those avenues. Yeah. It's nearly impossible for me to get an ad on Instagram or Facebook approved, to run a workshop. Even trying to sell a basic introduction to studio portrait photography, I had issues. Even though there was no nudity at all in the content, It was basically because I was linking back to a website which contained nudity in some areas that, it got shut down. So
that was the deal killer, that it was linking to some place that had that type of
they're never that forthcoming in their reasons why. They just basically say, yep, no, not approved.
Yeah.
So it is really difficult. So predominantly word of mouth is my thing, and while I can't run direct ads, I do have a reasonably good following on Instagram, with just under 70,000 followers. But I've been on that figure for about 2 years now. It just won't grow, and I think that's because of the algorithm that they've implemented, and something they call shadow banning. So I don't believe my name comes up in any search engines or anything like that anymore. So Instagram, Instagram's, because I was rating, growing that Instagram following by around about 10,000 every 6 months, and then all of a sudden it just stopped. So
I think that's a good that's a good hypothesis, that you were shadow banned, or some algorithm flagged you and said, no more. Let's just stop that right there.
That's right.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's scary that can happen, right?
Yeah.
With no sort of recourse on your side. There's no one to call. It's not like you had a copyright strike on YouTube and you could
that's right.
You can manage that. This is just sort of in the background, right?
Yep.
So then your marketing, like you said, consists mainly of word of mouth. Anything else that you're doing to get the word out?
Yeah. Well, I think from a business side of things, that for my client shoots, I've sort of evolved into working a lot with performers, mostly burlesque performers, and shifting that kind of straight boudoir into more of a vintage glamour style, which I really enjoy. And that's kind of helped it. And they're the sort of people that will initially probably book me just to do a promotional shoot for their latest routine, or just because they want some really nice kind of vintage style images of themselves. But then they're the sort of people that are kind of open to shooting nudes potentially, or they're just generally comfortable with their bodies. So I tend to get booked then for other styles of shoots as well afterwards. So
so it's like a gateway in bringing you in.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
and it also
I'm looking at some of your work now on your page while you're talking, man. I'm just like blown away. It's fantastically creative. I love your use of color, and the images feel like they're going to pop off the page from the way that you're using contrast and clarity and all that. So very, very well done.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's interesting. Color was never something I did a lot of up until probably in the last 4 or 5 years, I guess. For my artistic nude work, it was always black and white. It was very traditional. But I started implementing color a lot more, and even in the last probably 12 or 18 months, it's grown even further with the advent of RGB LED lights, which makes things a lot easier compared to using gels with flash. So that's been a bit of a game changer for changing my style in some ways.
Well, that's a good segue. I have a couple things I want to talk about. So we're gonna, after this next question, we're gonna dive into gear, and then I want to move into a little bit of post processing, and then some business.
Yep. Yeah, sure.
So want to back just to close the loop on the whole stigma around the different genres of photography. There's that whole concept of GWC, right? Are you familiar with the whole,
I am.
For those that don't know, GWC is an acronym for guy with camera, or somebody who wants to take pictures of pretty women or men, I would guess, with the express purpose of being, taking pictures of the women. So, how do you combat that stigma? Like when it's like boots on the ground, when you're talking with a model, either on the phone or digitally or whatever, how do you put her at ease that you're not a GWC, and that, she's going to get great work out of you?
Well, I think luckily I'm at the point now in my career where my work pretty much speaks for itself. But initially, I know the challenges that people face when they're first starting out. And because I do run a lot of workshops and I get people coming along that have never even shot a model before. And I think workshops is a great way that people can meet some artistic nude models, get some images in their portfolio to show that they are, mostly interested in creating artistic work. I think the workshop side of things just opens up the access a lot easier than just trying to get out there cold and without having any images to show and just contacting models straight off the bat. So, but the other thing is that, there are a lot of professional models out there that are willing to work with first timers. So you just got to try and find those.
And what's the best way to find them? Is it like modeling agencies or Model Mayhem or?
Yeah, well, Model Mayhem to a degree. I started, shooting nudes myself when One Model Place was around. That was a big one.
I remember that one,
yeah, Net Model, and then Model Mayhem kind of took over. But there's probably a general feeling now that there's a lot more GWCs on Model Mayhem and a lot less professional models as well, to be honest. I think a lot of social media is still very important in this area, and I think a lot of models are just promoting themselves mainly on social media. So Instagram is still probably the biggest place where you can find models in your area, although it's very difficult to search for that specifically.
Yeah.
And even a lot of the hashtags, they don't get allowed anymore, so it's a bit more difficult. But probably the best way would probably to look at other photographers in your area that shoot this style of work and see which models they're working with, and then contact those models directly.
Very good. Very good. Well, let's switch gears and jump into, you open the box on gear, right? So people always want to know, especially looking at your images, what you're shooting with. You kind of alluded to the fact that, are you moving away from strobe and going with more continuous light, or what's your lighting?
I am to a degree, but mostly that's because I'm starting to shoot a lot more video as well now. And that obviously makes it a lot easier just to shoot with LEDs because you're using the same lighting. I still go back to flash for particular things because it does have its benefits. Obviously, LEDs don't give you as much power. So if you are trying to work at really low ISOs and keep your shutter speed reasonably fast, or you need to freeze any kind of motion, flash is definitely your best option there. But from the point of view of seeing the light and just being able to craft and shape that light, LED I've found is wonderful.
It's great, isn't it? Yeah, and I think a lot of the reason that you can make that statement is because cameras and low noise, low ISO, or high ISO, low noise is now a thing, right? Before, when we were stuck with just film or cameras that couldn't resolve in low light, we had to put all those lumens onto the sensor in order to get the image. Now that's not the case, right?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. We're spoiled. Really, we are.
We are.
Images. Yeah.
Every day I feel like one day I'm gonna bust out and say, hey, in my day we had to shoot on film and we only had one ISO per roll.
Well, interestingly, back in 2013, I went right back to the beginning and shot some wet plate collodion, and that was a challenge compared to how easy we have it shooting digital. So yeah.
Well, it's pushing the art form forward, I think, because everything is a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, you had to work to really get a good image way back then. Everything from shooting and film selection, and then in the dark room, it was work to get a good image. And then even then, only a very small amount of people would see the fruits of your labor.
Yeah, right? That's right. Yes.
Now it's instant gratification and broad audience, global audience, right?
Quite amazing.
So camera wise, well, back to the lighting.
Yeah.
So which LEDs did you go with?
I've got a bit of a range, actually. I've got some Lupo panels, the super panels, which are bicolor, and also the full color 30s, which are obviously RGB. But also recently, we got here at the studio some of the Nanlite 60C, the tube lights, and they're really fun to play with as well. It was one of those lighting the blue in the background there, which you can see.
Okay.
So,
yeah. That was really nice. Yeah, it's always the question, right? Is what gear or what light should I get, and then on top of that is what light modifiers. And now the question is strobe or continuous, and it goes on and on and on. I've seen at one of the shows I was recently at, there was a company called Roto Light there. Have you seen those strobes?
Yeah.
Those are they're relatively on the expensive side, but I got a chance to shoot a couple of interviews with them, and they're like the Ferrari of LED lights, really, and they're even kind of colored like Ferraris too.
But some of the lighting that's available now is so inexpensive for the quality that you're getting. It's quite amazing. Some of the new products from Godox are amazing value, great value for money.
Yeah, I think that's probably my next move is Godox. I've been hearing a lot of good things about those guys. Next, the next move is, before we get into post, is just sort of the business side of it, or actually, people are probably wondering what camera you shoot with, when you're doing these images. Do you have a preference in camera body?
I do. For the majority of my career up until around 2015, I shot purely Nikon, or Nikon, how you say it over there. I started with film cameras, 35mm film cameras, and then moved into the DSLRs. But around that 2015 mark, I was really craving a change. I wanted something lighter weight, and I picked up a Fuji X-T1 and a couple of prime lenses, which was a tiny little kit. My intention was to use that mostly for the travel photography and just kicking about. But I fell in love with it. Loved the manual controls that the Fujis gave. It took me right back to basics and shooting everything fully manual. And the electronic viewfinder with that instant feedback on your exposure was just brilliant. And I fell in love with mirrorless. So when the XT2s came out, I decided I'd get two of those and just sold off all my Nikon stuff. So now I'm currently shooting with an XT3 and an XH1. And I'm using the XT3 mostly for video, but at the times when I do need to shoot with two bodies, if I'm shooting an event, I'll shoot with both stills. But the XH1 is primarily my main stills camera. And I think the main reason for that is because of the inbuilt stabilization that it has. And shooting with the LED lighting, I can shoot slightly lower shutter speeds and still get some nice sharp results. So
Very good. Yeah, I hear people that shoot Fuji love Fuji, right?
Yep. Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely a cult.
Yeah. Or cult-like, at least.
Cult-like, yes.
So just to round the whole thing out on just sort of the technical side of things, post-processing. A lot of photographers are trying out Capture One. Some people are in Lightroom. Everybody's in Photoshop. What's your sort of stack of post-processing images? Software?
I'm still Lightroom and Photoshop. I have heard that the Fuji files perform a bit better in Capture One, but honestly, I've got 15 plus years of work in Lightroom catalogs that I find really easy to access. It's all organized. I know where it is. So it's a big change for me to swap over to a new program now, and I'm definitely not unhappy with the results I get processing my files through Lightroom. So Lightroom has its challenges. It's not particularly fast, but it's not a big hindrance for me. It seems to work pretty well. One other program I do use occasionally, if I've shot a big event and I've got many thousands of images to sort through, I'll use Photo Mechanic to do my culling, because that is super quick.
Yeah, they're actually coming on the show in a couple of weeks.
Oh, great. Excellent. Yeah. I've been using their programs for probably 15 years. So, so that's a great way as a workaround. You do your massive cull through something like Photo Mechanic, and then just import your selects into Lightroom and work on them that way. What
about the plugins that you use for Photoshop and or Lightroom? Are you using anything like portraiture for retouching, or are you doing it all by hand?
Mostly by hand now. I did use the Nik software plugins for quite a while.
Yeah.
And I used the dynamic skin softener in that in the Color Effects Pro 2 module for quite a while. But now I'm actually doing most of that basic skin softening in Lightroom, thanks to Michael Sasser.
Yeah, there you go.
who did a YouTube video on how to do that using a graduation tool, and then the pulling the texture back and using color range to just select the skin tone. So that was a great little tip. Thank you, Michael, for that tip. So I'm using that all the time now.
That's cool. That is really cool. Yeah, and keeping it minimal. That's admirable, right. Especially looking at the work that you're doing. It's flawless. So clearly what you're doing is working, and like the Lightroom Photoshop combination. It's people are sticking with it. And some people are diving into Capture One as well. But it's nice that we have these choices out there for us to sort of gravitate, move into. To round it out, I want to talk a little bit about. We talked about getting clients. We talked about the light. We talked about the differences between the different genres, gear, cameras and all that. But and post processing. But at the beginning and the end of that is the business side of things, right? So So how does that work? It's
always the toughest part.
It's the toughest part, right? And the part that most artists kind of shy away from. But on the take me through the how you structured that piece of it in terms of booking. How do people, if a customer wants to book you, how do they do that? And then what's the pricing structure and that piece of the business?
Yeah, it's always a challenge to work that out, especially initially, and it's always a fluid thing that changes quite a lot. I guess the hardest part is getting the clients in the door to begin with, and as we mentioned, there's challenges in marketing for this kind of area. So I've over the years developed really good relationships with some of the burlesque schools here in Brisbane. So there's 3 or 4 of those currently running that have new students coming through all the time to learn that style of dance, and they tend to all be interested in getting photos at some stage. I do photograph a lot of their student performances, and that gives me an introduction to the newer students as well. They get to know my work just from the images that I capture of them on stage, and then a lot of them will come to me later and want to book in for a shoot. Something I've found that works pretty well is I've started opening up the studio on a particular day and offering mini shoots at a lower price.
Okay.
So I will shoot maybe 15 women in one day. They're all paying obviously a much reduced rate than what they would if they were booking me for a couple of hours for a full shoot. But they only get 15 or 20 minutes in front of the camera. So I'm lucky that I've got a studio that I can have 2 or 3 setups at once. So they get a choice. So they can choose which background they want or what sort of lighting that I've set up for each. And they get 15 minutes, and then they'll get 50 shots or something that they can choose from, and they'll get a couple of edits. And so while they're getting a great deal, I'm still only shooting for 4 hours or so, but shooting 15 people, and so that works out to a pretty good day for me.
That's great.
Yeah, so that sort of has been something I developed around about 8 months ago, and that's worked really well. And so now I'm starting to come up with different themes for different days. So
Oh, that's
I'm also
great. Are you doing it on a daily basis, or like just like a special
no,
one special day a week?
yeah, one special day probably every month or so, to be honest.
Oh,
Because
okay.
I'm also doing there is really not enough people here to be running it any more often than that. But I'm also, running workshops every month and doing just general one-on-one shoots as well. So it all kind of adds up, which is what you need to do. I think these days you need to have different avenues of income. So
Absolutely. I use the metaphor like a submarine, right? A submarine is divided up into multiple chambers so that if one gets compromised and flooded, the whole thing doesn't go down. You still have multiple. Same thing with revenue streams. You got to have multiple coming in, because if one dries up, you still have to eat and pay your bills and, and survive. So
yeah, totally. And it's definitely a challenge. And like you said, these things ebb and flow. So while, for a couple of months, the workshops might be going really well, and then they'll drop off for a bit, but something else will pick up. So, yeah, you've got to really have a few options going at once.
Absolutely. So, what's next for Cam Attree? What's on the horizon? Looking out 6 months, a year, or whatever. What would you like to have happen?
Well, I'd really like to ramp up the workshop side of things a bit more. I've just teamed up with a good mate of mine in Sydney, Tim Bradshaw, and we've created Reveal Photographic. So we're going to be doing some destination retreats and workshops to some pretty cool places once everything is back to normal. So that's definitely
as we record this. Just for folks that don't know, as we record this, it is April of 2020, which means we are, hopefully towards the end of the global pandemic, but we may be at the beginning. Who knows? But there's that level of uncertainty, and the impact on, especially service businesses like Cam's are, having to be creative about what they're doing in order to make it through the storm, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yep. Yeah. So the workshops, and then
workshops.
If people want to connect with those workshops, is it just all on your website?
There's a new website. Well, my monthly kind of studio workshops is on my website, and then the destination retreats is on revealphotographic.com. So you can check that out.
Revealphotographic.com. Got it.
Yeah, Reveal Photographic. Yeah. The other thing that I'm really keen on producing is a complete video series on basically an art nude masterclass.
Yeah.
There's a few out there, but I don't think everybody covers all the necessary aspects. A lot of them are heavily focused on just lighting technique and posing, but there's so much more to it. So I've made a start, and hopefully this year I'll have that completed. But I could be looking at 20 hours of content once I get everything done. So that's a big focus for me. I've already done a couple of ebooks, and there's some videos that are available for purchase or hire through Vimeo on demand. Mm-hmm. So I've got a few things out there at the moment, but I really want to consolidate a lot of that information and put it into one really great resource.
That's great. I think that's a move. That's a good move, to just sort of put everything on one thing, that then you can keep refining that over time as things change. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yep.
Okay, well, Cam, thank you so much for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
You being so candid and talking about the business and the hardware and the gear and the software and all that. I think it's going to be helpful to a lot of people, and I would definitely suggest people just head over to your website and check you out, reach out to you, follow you, and just be inspired by the portfolio. It's fantastic.
Yeah. One thing that I forgot to mention, I do also have a members website, which you'll see the link to on the front page of my main website, and that's the artofnudephotography.com. So that's where I share a lot of my work that can't be shared anywhere else due to obvious reasons. So there's a lot of behind the scenes videos, which is great to see, how I work, and also there's some tutorial stuff on there as well. So membership is pretty cheap, especially with how poor the Australian dollar is. So for anybody in the, buying in, paying in US dollars, it's really cheap. So
it's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
It's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again, and best of luck with everything. You stay safe down there.
Yeah. You too. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
You're welcome.
Thanks,
I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying in this room forever.
Yeah. For the foreseeable future, anyway.
For this foreseeable future, for sure. All right, Cam Attree, thank you, sir.
Cool.
This is Twip.